Good morning. On behalf of ASEA International and the U.S. Naval Institute, welcome to West 2015. We're very proud to bring you this conference in its 25th year. Our keynote speaker this morning has answered the call to serve. He served 27 years as a Marine Corps officer, commanding line units and leading Marines. He served 4 years as the Undersecretary of the Navy. And last year, in April, he was confirmed as the Deputy Secretary of Defense. When you have complex issues to solve, and we do, you need leaders who are smart, innovative, and analytical. We need leaders who are not afraid to check in on the wisdom of others. The Honorable Robert O. Work is such a leader. He lives at the intersection of ideas, strategy, and resources, and we are very fortunate to have him here today with us as our kickoff speaker. Let's give a big applause to the Honorable Robert Work.
Well, good morning, everyone. First, I'd like to thank the U.S. Naval Institute and AFCEA, along with all the corporate sponsors here today and who are not here, and everyone else behind the back scenes who makes this wonderful conference so successful every year. Admiral Daly, General Shea, it looks like you've hit another home run this year, and the theme, lower budgets and higher demands. How do we strike the right balance? That's exactly the right question we need to be asking ourselves every single day. So it's a real pleasure to be here as part of an impressive lineup of speakers over the next 3 days. Now, to be honest, it's a pleasure to be anywhere except for the Pentagon, but Southern California is really high on my list, especially since I'll be going to Minot, North Dakota to visit our nuclear warriors tomorrow where it's -8 degrees. In fact, every time I get out of the Pentagon, I'm reminded of a show that I watched a month or two ago. It was called Eaten Alive. Did anybody see this movie, or this show? For some reason, this guy gets in his head that he wants to be eaten by a python. Now, you can't make this up. So he studied, and he said pythons exert 90 pounds per square inch of pressure on their prey as they crush them before they eat them. So he had a special bodysuit made that could withstand 90 psi. He had a camera on his head so that when he gets swallowed by the python, he'd be able to watch it. And he actually did it. They went out and found like this 30-foot python, and they cover him with pig's blood so he looks like an animal. And sure enough, the python wraps him up and starts slowly crushing him. And you can hear him going, you know, it wasn't really a good idea. And finally, in the very end, the python opened his mouth, I guess it was a he, but opens its mouth and started to swallow him, but at that point he tapped out. His arm was kind of twisted behind, and he said, "Get me out of here." And I said, you know, this is a story about political appointees in the Pentagon. No matter how well you prepare, you just get sucked into the vortex. And every day, the pressures from all sides are just unbelievable. So anytime you can get out and be pulled out of the mouth of the python, it's a good day. Now, this morning, I want to talk to you all about the department's fiscal year 2016 defense budget request, the strategic decisions that went into the request, and how we're trying to strike that balance between lower budgets and higher demands. I'll be talking a few numbers this morning, but not too many. It's just too damn early for that. But without further ado, let me just start with the bottom line up front. I think most of you have heard this before. The President's budget request totals about $534 billion in fiscal year 2016. It also includes $51 billion in the Overseas Contingency Operation, or OCO, request. For the first time in a while, we submitted both together. This is a total of $585 billion of our taxpayers' hard-earned money. Now, these numbers are about $36 billion above the FY16 sequestration caps, which remain in effect at this point, and about $38 billion, or 7.6% higher than the enacted FY 2015 budget levels. Now, these figures are right in line with those that we submitted last year, and they reflect what I would argue strongly to be a strategy-driven, resource-informed budget that starts to begin to restore the capacity and capabilities needed to meet future challenges by reversing long-term modernization. Now, let me just provide you with a little background. Each year, as most of you know, the services prepare their program objective memorandum, what they think that they should be doing in their defense program over the next 5 years, or the future year defense program. They're submitted. This year they were submitted late. They didn't come in until September. So at that point, you start what is called a fall review, and you start to review all of the service input and start to make judgments about where you ought to be shifting money in a resource-constrained environment. Now, this process occurs literally in a windowless room in the bowels of the Pentagon, and that's where the sausage is made. Literally, hours and hours are spent where all of the senior leaders of the departments, generally the vice chiefs of the services, the undersecretaries, all of the different staff members, and the COCOMs, the combatant commanders, they call in VTCN most of the time. And we deliberate the future defense program and try to make trades. And that's where we make our strategic priorities and hash out where will we invest our money. Now, before doing so, this year, we had to answer a very important question. We were operating under a strategy that was outlined last year in March 2014 in the Quadrennial Defense Review. It was actually published in March 2014. But 3 surprises occurred right on the heels of its publication. So we had to ask ourselves, did these geopolitical surprises or events cause the strategy to no longer be valid? First, beginning in February 2014, actually before we published the QDR, Russia destabilized, illegally occupied, and then attempted to annex Crimea. Moscow then backed separatist activity in eastern Ukraine, violating international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, these actions suggested, unless we could convince Moscow to change its course, that we and our NATO allies were going to be entering into a period of prolonged, heightened tension with Russia. The second surprise came in June, as the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL, launched an offensive out of northeast Syria into Iraq. That surprised us only insofar as the collapse of the Iraqi forces. The threat to our people and our interests, along, most importantly, with the formation of a partner, a new, more inclusive Iraqi government that we could work with, prompted our leadership, President Obama, and our senior military and our allies and partners to forge a counter-ISIL coalition and use force in Iraq and Syria to confront that threat. Then the third came in August. The CDC projected that unless something dramatic happened, there were going to be 1.4 million people in Western Africa infected with the Ebola virus. In response, President Obama spearheaded an international effort to confront this national security threat posed by Ebola and its potential spread. And luckily, it seems as though our intervention has really paid dividends. So there we were. We're in September. We had just gotten the services POMs. These 3 events had just happened. Boom, boom, boom. They came on top of an already volatile security environment, including the transition of our mission in Afghanistan from combat operations to train, advise, and assist the Afghan people as they take over their own security, ongoing negotiations over Iran's nuclear program, China's provocative activities in the East and South China Seas, and global cyber attacks, which culminated, as you know, in November and December, the theft of Sony's networks. Now, what was readily apparent to all is we have the finest partners and allies that any nation can ask for. But when we were asking them to help in Afghanistan, to help in Ebola, to help in Iraq and Syria, it quickly became evident that the capabilities and capacities of our allies were tapped out. And so, like it or not, the United States would remain the global security first responder. And that even as we continue to devote considerable resources to deterring aggression and assuring our allies and partners through forward engagement in multiple theaters. In fact, we have 211,000 military personnel right now serving in 136 countries around the world. And while the overall demand for ground combat forces is coming down as we end our combat mission in Afghanistan, demand for deployable ground combat headquarters, missile defense, ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, naval, aerospace forces remains quite high. The operational tempo, and personnel tempo, the amount of time our servicemen and women stay away from home, is still high. But after some debate, when answering whether these aforementioned surprises, along with our continued global engagement, fundamentally shifted the underlying assumptions that underpinned our 2014 strategy, we concluded that the strategy was not yet broken. The answer was very much, it just wasn't apparent yet. We had the time to sift through to see what would play out in Iraq and Syria, what would play out in Europe, what would play out in West Africa. So, like I said, in the end, we concluded that our strategy remains sound, and we think the priorities identified in the QDR remain intact, and those 5 are: number 1, rebalance to the Asia-Pacific region. That will continue. Number 2, maintaining a strong commitment to security and stability in Europe and the Middle East. Number 3, sustaining a global counterterrorism campaign. Number 4, strengthening key alliances and partnerships. And number 5, prioritizing key modernization efforts. Now, we recognize that the assumptions that underpinned each of these 5 priorities would have to continually be reviewed, especially with regard to what is happening in Europe and the Middle East. And that's what we will do as we go into the POM 17, the President's Budget 17, which, God help me, we're starting right now. Now, we reached the same conclusion on our strategy's force planning construct. That tells us how big of a joint force you need to implement the strategy. Now, this construct calls for a smaller, leaner, technologically advanced joint force able in peacetime to do 3 things: defend our homeland, carry out global counterterrorist operations in multiple theaters, and deter aggression and assure allies through forward presence and engagement in multiple theaters. If deterrence fails at any given time, the joint force had to be large enough to defeat a regional adversary in what we called a large-scale multi-phase joint campaign, while at the same time imposing costs or denying the objectives of another aggressor in another region, the so-called win-deny. Now, we concluded that the force we submitted last year in PB-15, fiscal year 2015, remained broadly sufficient to need, with one key exception, and that was in ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. We made a bet last year that as we pulled out of Afghanistan, we'd be able to start drawing down some of the permissive airborne ISR, but with the uptick in violence in Iraq and Syria, essentially what happened is those extra caps or sorties just shifted right into Iraq and Syria. So as a result, when you study the PB-16, the President's Budget 16 force structure, you'll find it to be very consistent with PB-15. We continue to believe we can execute the strategy, even with all of the things that are going on in the world, with manageable levels of risk. But without question, there are elevated levels of risk in pockets throughout the force. There's elevated risk in missile defense, there's elevated risk in ISR, etc. In sum, then, we'll continue to closely scrutinize whether our strategy, force structure, and global allocation of forces is in keeping with this unbelievably complex and volatile world that we find ourselves in, and that we're keeping pace with the demands that are being levied upon our servicemen and women in the forces that they participate in. But let me just tell you this, with the high degree of fiscal uncertainty, I told you that we're above the sequestration level caps in our submission. In fact, if you total up the total amount of money between FY16 and FY20 and compare it to the sequestration caps that are currently the law of the land, our submission is about $150 billion higher than sequestration. Now, with the threat of sequestration over our heads, there is no way that any responsible leader would recommend that we would increase force structure right now. It would just cause more problems than it would solve. So that's why we have to use the force we have very dynamically across the world. And it's why we are requesting $585 billion for both budget and OCO funding, because we believe that is what we need to execute the strategy at manageable levels of risk. But let me make clear to everybody in here and everyone who's watching, even though we're about $150 billion above the sequestration caps in our request, maintaining the balance between personnel, readiness, and modernization is extremely challenging. That's why we believe firmly that any reduction in funding below the President's budget level, or any broad denial of the request that we have put into our budget to Congress, is really going to cause some problems and would make the overall risks to the current strategy that we have, which we believe is the right one for this point in time in our country's history, would become unmanageable. And let me explain why we think that's the case. First, as you all know here, we're coming out of 13 years of war. It's caused an enormous strain on the servicemen and women who have volunteered to serve their nation, as well as the equipment which they operate. We have long planned to take a 2 to 3 year reset after winding down combat operations in Afghanistan. In sports term, we have been saying for many years that we would need a couple rebuilding years to replace worn-torn equipment, to take down the pressure on our servicemen and women, and to train our troops for different types of operations which they may face in the future. So as this last year has shown us, we just cannot be ready for one thing. We can't be a counterinsurgency force. We can't be a high-end multi-phase campaign force. We have to be able to do all those things, and it takes time to do so. So because of the high operational tempo that I just described to you, we're not doing a reset, we're doing a running reset. We're trying to reset in stride. We're building this airplane while it's flying. And this makes it even more challenging because the sequestration hit that hit us in FY 2013 really was a punch in the gut. And that really had a deleterious impact on readiness across the board. And as a result, readiness remains at troubling levels. Our forward deployed forces, let me make sure everybody understands that. Our forward deployed forces are locked, cocked, and ready to go. They're ready to answer the call, they have the proper training, they have the proper equipment, and they would be able to operate in almost any environment that you can conceive of. But the surge force, the heavy-duty Sunday punch that is necessary, or that you throw when necessary, that's not as ready as it's been in the past. There's no question about it. And this is something that troubles us very much. Now, it's important to note that we just can't dump money at this problem. This is a problem now as much as time as it is of money. So what we're doing is we adjusted the in-strength ramps of both the Army and the Marine Corps. They're coming down slightly shallower than planned last year, and that's to allow less personnel turbulence in the combat units. That will help near-term readiness. We added money to home station training so that the forces that are home would be able to get to the ranges and get the training they needed. And we invested in our range infrastructure, which is very, very important for us to maintain highly ready forces. We also added funding to reduce the maintenance backlog. Each of the services' O&M accounts, operations, maintenance, or readiness accounts, increased by nearly 10% over last year. But we concluded that you can't put too much more money at this problem because as you go towards full spectrum combat readiness, it takes time. These gains are very fragile. For example, the Army says that to be full spectrum combat ready, they would like each of their brigade combat teams to go to the National Training Center and do 2 rotations. By that time, all of your junior leaders, junior officers, mid-level officers, senior officers have worked together, understand the problem, can work together, and be very effective. Well, we're maxed out. We can only send 19 BCTs per year to the National Training Center. So money is not going to help that. It will take some time. Meanwhile, the Army and the Air Force, their demand is extremely high, especially in the Central Command area of responsibility and the Pacific Command area of responsibility. Those 2 demand signals remain very high. So the aerospace and naval forces are out and about, and they're not spending enough time at home station to get all of the training done before deploying. So even if Congress gets rid of sequestration and gives us the full President's budget level, it's going to take until 2020 for the Army, Marines, and Navy to get back to full spectrum combat readiness, and it's going to take the Air Force until 2023. Now, when you hear that, you say, holy crap, well, this is bad, what do we do? But I'd like you to think back to Vietnam, another very long war, which had a big impact on our forces. And I would argue, after the ground forces came out of Vietnam in 1970, and after our aerospace and Navy forces essentially stopped combat operations in 1972, it probably took until 1985, 1986, 1987 for us to regain full spectrum combat readiness. Now, I grant that at that point we were shifting from a draft service to an all-volunteer service, which made the transition a little longer. But I would say that we need to just stick at it. Readiness is something you just keep at it. Now, the second challenge is because personnel and operations and maintenance costs increase faster than the rate of inflation, the department needs to see 1% to 3% real growth per year to maintain balance between personnel readiness and modernization. But we have been at flat budget levels for 3 years now. FY13, FY14, and FY15, we've essentially had the same amount, $496 billion a year. So to free up resources, we've tried to become more efficient and discipline use of our defense resources, and we think we've been very good at doing that. The department has gone through 4 rounds of efficiency initiatives, which sought to shift defense spending what we call tail to tooth combat power. But these savings often come over time, and they really do not keep up with the increased spending in both O&M and personnel costs. So we're constantly struggling to keep up with that. Moreover, Congress has denied us several of our requests to be more efficient or to shift money into higher priority programs. They denied the Air Force their ability to completely divest themselves of the A-10. They denied the Navy's ability to put 11 cruisers in deferred modernization so that we would be able to keep 11 cruisers in the fleet into the 2040s. They denied the Army's Aviation Restructure Initiative. And even though we've reduced our force, and we continue to reduce our force, Congress continues to reject are repeated requests for a base realignment and closure or BRAC round. Now, we project conservatively that would save us about $2 billion a year recurring. Yes, it's going to cost money up front, but $2 billion recurring is $10 billion across the 5-year defense plan. That's a lot of modernization, I will tell you. In this environment, it is real money. Maintaining outdated and duplicative systems and unwanted infrastructure drains scarce resources that should go elsewhere into the program. It is wasteful, it's strategically unsound, and it ultimately endangers the readiness of our men and women in uniform. The third challenge is that we've become very clear is we believe, and we have concluded without question, that the tremendous margin of technological superiority that the United States has typically enjoyed since the end of World War II is eroding. And it is eroding at what we consider to be an accelerated pace. We think this is a major challenge facing not only our department, but America as a whole. Because ultimately, America's leadership in the world depends on the military's ability to project joint power across transoceanic distances. And if technological overmatch starts to put into question our ability to do that, then it could affect not only our allies by undermining the assurance we give our allies that we'll be there when needed, and it may undermine deterrence. We're seeing levels of new weapons developments that we haven't seen since the mid-'80s, near the peak of the Soviet Cold War defense spending. Russia is modernizing its forces right now, and they were once in a very steep decline. In Eastern Europe, it's combining conventional military pressure with asymmetric economic and other intimidation means a Russian model of proxy war. From 2011 to 2016, we estimate that China's defense budget increased by 500%. Their military is rapidly fielding new weapons and systems. It is astonishing to see the number of programs that they are developing at a single point. It's really eye-watering. Iran has built up an array of asymmetric capabilities, including mines and missile-firing small boats and ballistic missiles, advanced anti-ship missiles with advanced seekers. North Korea's conventional military power is imposing because of its size, but that worries us less than its growing arsenal of nuclear weapons and road-mobile ballistic missiles that put our allies and forces in the region at risk, as well as potentially the United States. So all of these things are starting to erode our ability to project power across transoceanic distances. And as I said, that is a problem that we do not want to see continue. So 2016, if you look at where we start to put the money, you'll see that we're starting to try to reverse the years of underinvestment in new weapons and capabilities, and we're putting them right into the areas in the 2014 QDR. If you read the QDR, you'll see exactly where our money is going. We're making much-needed investments in our nuclear enterprise. As I said, I go to Minot tomorrow to talk with the nuclear warriors there, to visit our nuclear missile force and our bomber force. They're a critical part, both, of our triad, and I want to see if the investments we're making are having a difference in their mission and their lives. Because of the proliferation of guided munitions and other advanced technologies that threaten our ability to project power, we're spending more on what we refer to as counter A2AD, counter anti-access area denial weapons. We put more money into missile defense, new sensors, communications, and advanced munitions. Our space constellation is under more threat now than it has been at any time. We rely on our space constellation in ways that are hard to explain to the average American, and the asymmetric advantage that it has long provided us. Our constellation is now under threat, so we've increased money for both space resiliency and space control capabilities. And I don't need to tell you, we've put money into more cyber capabilities, into our network and systems defense, and into our other capabilities. So we're increasing spending overall in cyber. Trying to tackle this erosion of technical superiority was exactly what Secretary Hagel had in mind when he announced the Defense Innovation Initiative in November. It's a department-wide effort to identify a third offset strategy, and I'll explain that in just a second, or perhaps more accurately, offset strategies, in order to sustain and advance our military technical edge into the 21st century. Now, we had two offset strategies prior. The United States have two offset strategies. Cold War strategies, really focused on the Central Front and the confrontation we had with the Soviet Union after World War II. In the 1950s and 1960s, the offset strategy was based on our superiority in tactical and strategic nuclear weapons. By the 1970s, when the Soviets had achieved parity in both of these areas, we went after a second offset strategy, which looked at guided munitions, stealth, and surveillance, which allowed us to project the same destructive effects with conventional weapons that heretofore we could only use tactical nuclear weapons. We will also seek to identify new concepts of operations, just like we did in the Cold War with air-land battle and the maritime strategy. Now, doing this is going to be really difficult, again, for three big reasons. First, we no longer face a single implacable foe like we did in the Soviet Union, with the Soviet Union. It was a pretty stable competition in which it was a two-sided affair. We had intelligence, they had intelligence. We were trying to see what was going on. We had a pretty good measure of our potential adversary, and it was a relatively easy competition. Not easy in the sense that it was any less dangerous or any less difficult, but easy in the sense that we had only one adversary we really had to concentrate on. Now, we have to consider advanced states like Russia and China. We have to consider regional states like Iran and North Korea. We have to consider non-state actors with advanced capabilities. This makes it far more difficult, and that's why I say it's probably more accurate to say we will have a third offset strategies, because we may have to have different ones for each of the three. Second, we find ourselves in a very different competitive environment. In the 1950s and 1960s, we were spending a lot of money on missiles, on nuclear weapons, the early computer age. In the 60s and 70s, we started putting money into space. It was all generally government-driven. But today, commercial adaptation and commercial innovation is really the thing that is causing all of us to scratch our heads and say, where are we headed? Robotics, autonomous operating, guidance and control systems, new ways of visualization, biotechnology, miniaturization, advanced computing, big data, additive manufacturing like 3D printing. All of those advances are being pushed primarily in the commercial sector. So the department must devise a means of working closely with the commercial sector and to make sure that we're taking care and we're exploiting all of the advances that they are doing. And that's essentially what a big part of Frank Kendall, our Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition Technology and Logistics, is doing in his Better Buying Power 3.0. Third, technology diffusion is likely to impact the durability of the advantage. Our first offset strategy, which we started in the 1940s, lasted until 1975. Our second offset strategy extended from about 1975 to now. We're talking decades. Now, with the pace of change and with commercial technology changing so often, the third offset strategies will have a far more challenging temporal component in the competition. So therefore, we think in terms now of the first FYDP, 5-year defense plan. 5 years out, what can we do with the stuff that we have differently to have a new advantage? Or what capabilities can we pull in very, very quickly? Then we take a look at the second and third FYDPs, the next 10 years. And we are now trying to develop those systems like railguns and high-energy lasers that hopefully we'll be able to field in that decade. And finally, we look at the fourth and FIDP and beyond, and what are the science and technology investments we need to make today to make that happen. So you'll see in the FY16 budget some really potentially game-changing technologies that we think can more quickly get to the force. And you'll see more long-range research efforts. For example, we're investing more in unmanned underwater vehicles, high-speed strike weapons, rail guns, and high-energy lasers. Frank has announced a new aerospace innovation initiative which seeks to develop a wide range of advanced aeronautical capabilities to maintain air dominance throughout the next couple decades. But I want to make sure that everybody understands. I hear this all the time. This is just another technology-driven thing. No, it's not. It really is about what can we do in terms of operational concepts, and what can we do differently to provide us with an advantage. I think this is very much like the 20s and 30s. At that point, there were all sorts of different technological advances in mechanization, radio, sensors like radar and sonar, airplanes. We were building literally production batches of airplanes of 10 or 15, and they would be obsolete before the next production batch was going. It wasn't so much the technology, it was the competitors who could say, let me pull all of these things together to make an operational concept like blitzkrieg or carrier-based operations or anti-submarine warfare. They were the ones who were able to really have an advantage. So a big part of the third offset strategies is to find new innovative ways to employ promising technologies. So I'll give you an example. This has been talked about on the blogs. My good friend Brian McGrath wrote a very good blog of using the Block 4 Tomahawk in an anti-ship role. It's a missile that's proven. It is an awesome missile. It has enormous capabilities. But just a few weeks ago, the USS Kidd, one of our guided missile destroyers, launched a Tomahawk missile that changed course mid-flight and struck a moving ship after being cued by an aircraft. Now, this is potentially a game-changing capability for not a lot of cost. It's a 1,000-mile anti-ship cruise missile. It can be used from practically our entire surface and submarine fleet. What happens if we take another step and just make an advanced seeker on the Tomahawk rather than building a new missile? We believe if we make decisions like that, that we will be able to outturn potential adversaries and maintain our technological superiority. Tom Roden talks about having distributed lethality in the fleet, and this is exactly the way we can go about doing it. So that's just one example of the way we're using existing weapons in new ways, and it's only one, some of which we're going to tell you about and some of which we won't. Part of the offset strategy, everyone constantly says, why don't you tell us your strategy? Well, if you're a strategist, you say, you dummy. You never tell your potential adversary what your strategy is. You want to make sure that they guess all the time. So some of the things we're doing in our budget will not be readily apparent. But let me tell you, the things that we are doing are going to greatly complicate any adversary's attempts to fight against U.S. forces. Now, I know a lot of people are asking about UCLASS, the Unmanned Carrier-Launched Aerial Surveillance and Strike System. We decided this year, we were almost ready to launch the RFP, but we decided we need to take a pause because we want to consider the UCLASS as part of the joint family of unmanned surveillance strike systems and make sure that we're going after the right capabilities. So in addition to looking at new capabilities we already have and using them differently, we're going to make sure in this environment that when we do go after a new platform, it's the platform that we need from a joint perspective. So all of this stuff is done with one thing in mind, to provide our troops with a decisive competitive advantage. Ultimately, it's not winning on the future battlefield. If it's not about winning on the future battlefield, I, as a Deputy Secretary of Defense, don't want to waste a moment's time on it. Our job is very simple. We have a mission. And that mission is to organize, train, and equip a joint force that is built and ready for war and operated forward to preserve the peace. Everything else that we do, if it's not focused on that mission, it's a damn waste of time. So every day when I get up, I ask myself, how can we make the future lives of our servicemen and women better by providing them the tools that they're going to need to prevail in war? So let me conclude by saying and echoing what the service chief said just a couple weeks ago before Congress. Returning to sequestration level would be a disaster, in my view. It just doesn't make sense. Everyone you talk to says it doesn't make sense. But then they say, but we can't figure out how to de-trigger it. Well, that's what you're elected for, all right? Go figure it out. Put some pizzas. Hey, we do this in the Pentagon all the time. Lock yourself in a room, feed your pizzas for 6 weeks. I guarantee you, at some point, you'll say uncle and come out with an answer. But sequestration is a blunder that allows our fiscal problems, not our security needs, to determine our strategy. If you want a budget-driven strategy, and I hear this all the time, you've got a budget-driven strategy, I would say, no, we don't. We have a strategy-driven, resource-informed budget. But if you want a budget-driven strategy, go to sequestration. The budget that we are submitting supports the National Defense Strategy. We think the National Defense Strategy is the right one for our nation. We would not submit a budget that would nullify it. The senior leadership of the department is in total agreement with President Obama that sequestration must be overturned. In the coming months, we will provide updated details on whatever Congress needs, what we need to do, but we want to work closely with them to get rid of this very destructive and very non-strategic way forward. As I said, I've talked a lot about technology today, but the thing that is the secret weapon of the United States military are its men and women. It's men and women in uniform, it's men and women in the civilian workforce, and the contractors that support us. And the millions of Americans, well, maybe not millions anymore, but a whole bunch of Americans on a defense industrial base. Together, the innovation that lies within these people's minds and their abilities is just eye-watering. That's why political appointees go back into the Pentagon, because no matter where they work, I guarantee you when they come back into the Pentagon, they're surrounded by people that are just so remarkable that it makes their lives better. I like to say to everyone, I did this at the Navy birthday ball, this is a war-fighting force. That's why we exist. And in the spirit of Navy, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Evans, who's the commanding officer of the USS Destroyer Johnson, told his crew on his change of command ceremony on the fantail of his ship, "This is a fighting ship, and I intend to take her in harm's way. And anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." Now, those weren't hollow words for him, I guarantee you. At the Battle of Samar, he turned his little ship to do battle with Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships. And although he lost his ship and his life, and many of the crew that willingly followed him, he helped save 4 escort carriers in his task force for further action. He earned a posthumous Medal of Honor. I guarantee you we have a lot of Ernest Evans in this force. And that is why any adversary of the United States should always think twice about crossing swords with us. I want to thank everybody in here for what you do for your nation. There are people who are retirees, there are people who are on active duty, there are contractors, there's government civilians, there's our defense industrial base. Together, we can get through this time of declining budgets and increased demands if we work together and keep our mind on the men and women who serve us every day. Thank you. As always, my 30-minute speech turned into a little longer, but I am here to answer a couple questions if you would like.
Thank you, sir. First question, You talked a lot about people and they are being of paramount importance. How do budgets reflect the need to retain the best and brightest?
Well, that's a question that we talk about all the time. In the end, we have a very simple motto: mission first, people always. Now, our compensation packages have to be able to retain the best and brightest, to attract and retain the best and brightest. And so every time we make a change to our compensation packages, we debate, how will this play out? Now, the one thing I will tell you is this budget did not know what the Retirement Commission was going to recommend. So this budget makes nothing and no changes to our retirement. That will be debated over the next 60 days. President Obama has 60 days to respond to the 15 recommendations of the Retirement Commission and the Military Compensation Modernization Commission, same thing. They made 15 recommendations. We have 60 days to figure out if they really are a good thing for our men and women. The choices that we made, we raised our, last year we thought we might be at 1% pay raise, but we raised it because we saw the ECI was going up. It's not over the ECI. We couldn't afford to do that, but we felt that that was the prudent way to go. We continue to go after 95% of our basic allowance for housing, and there's all sorts of different things now on the retirement, on the healthcare side that we have to consider, because that was a major part. The two major things of the commission that came out were their recommendations on retirement and their recommendations on TRICARE. For the next 60 days, we're really going to dig into that and figure out. The chiefs every day ask themselves, are the things we are doing for our men and women, are they the right things to do? So you'll see many of the same recommendations we made last year, modified slightly because of input we've received not only from our servicemen and women, but also from our commanders. But generally, we're on the same package that we submitted last year. But keeping our men and women in uniform, attracting the right ones, and keeping the best ones, that's what we think about all the time.
Thank you, sir. Next question. Could you speak to some key adds or potential risks in the area of Homeland Security investments?
The primary ads that we put in on Homeland Defense, or Homeland Security investments, are primarily in the terms of cyber forces right now. We also spent a lot of money, or started to shift a lot of money around in our missile defense capabilities. We want to improve the reliability of the interceptors that we have. We want to go after a new long-range surveillance radar, which will help discrimination. We're putting more guided missile shooters out in Japan, which will also be able to help us defend the homeland. We also did an awful lot of things to look at counter-strike weapons, et cetera, against any type of weapon that might threaten the homeland. But inside the continental United States, our primary job is to assist in cybersecurity, and that's where we put a lot of our money in terms of cyber protection teams, different types of cyber ranges to allow our teams to be able to. Right now, it's kind of crazy. We'll have an exercise and we'll put together a cyber range, which will allow people to fight against each other in the cyber area. But then we break it all down. So we want to have a permanent cyber range. But those are the primary areas. I think I'm close to getting the hook. Maybe one last question, and then I'll get off the stage.
Thank you, sir. Final question. How can we complete the pivot to the Pacific with the current Navy ship count? And does the AFSB show a path to more low ship costs?
Well, we are rebalancing the Pacific without question. That goes on. Four of the biggest construction projects we've had since the end of World War II are right now ongoing in the Pacific region. We're shifting forces down to Camp Humphreys in Korea. We have just built an incredible platform at Iwakuni, where we're bringing a carrier air wing down along with our U.S. Marine forces there. We are starting the Fatima replacement project on Okinawa, and we're just about ready to start building up to allow Marine forces to shift to Guam. Those 4 are probably the biggest infrastructure projects we've had since the, certainly since the end of the Cold War. And our allies are working with us to make sure that we happen. So that's happening, it's ongoing, it will continue. The U.S. Navy will still put 60% of its ships in the Pacific. Now, maybe we'll have 306 ships, maybe we'll have 300, but 60% of the fleet will be there. We're putting an extra submarine in Guam, up to 4. We're building out all sorts of resiliency efforts throughout the Pacific. The Air Force is also putting an awful lot of its best capabilities in the Pacific. So regardless of the level of the budget we have, we will rebalance our forces there. The final question that we don't know is how big the Navy will ultimately be and how big the Air Force will ultimately be. But no matter how big they are, the relative effort of our forces will be focused on the Pacific. Again, I would like to thank you all for everything you do for your nation. God bless you all, and think of me in Minot tomorrow. It's going to be a lot colder.
Sure, thank you. Let me say a few words. Secretary Work, we know your time is precious, and despite your protestations that it's any day out of the Pentagon is a good day, it's a big effort to come here and share your thoughts with us at this important juncture. Thank you very much, and I'd like you to have this book, The Accidental Admiral, by a guy I think you know, Jim Stavridis, with whom you served with Richard Donzig, and an FCA bookmark. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you.